Mark 1. Conversations at the speed of sound.
Tell us, stand by. Stand by on top. It's contact. Take our enter, it's contact. Okay, the survivors open the yacht. Stand by on top. On this front tack. Roger. Stand by the drop. ASRK going. Now. Side data boy gone. First life raft is is less than half a mile from him. Okay, yep, the strata looks good. Okay, the two rafts look reasonable there. It's going to take quite a while. Okay, the ASRK looks like it will straddle him, Taco. You should be able to see that out your window now.
Audio there recorded on board RAAF P-3C Orion A9-760 on a search and rescue mission over the Southern Ocean in January 1997. Hello and welcome to this second of 3 episodes featuring the Queensland Air Museum's Lockheed P-3C Orion A9-760. You see, 2 distress calls had gone out from solo round-the-world yachtsmen. One, a Frenchman named Thierry Dubois from on board Amnesty International, and the other from Englishman Tony Bulleymore on the Exide Challenger, both of whom had foundered in the heavy seas in the Southern Ocean. 4 RAAF Orions took part in the search and rescue operation that this triggered. I'll let RAAF Flight Lieutenant Ludo Derricks, commanding 760, which was at the time designated Rescue 251, I'll let him pick up the story.
Yes, good morning. This is Rescue 251, Flight Lieutenant Derricks speaking. Okay, at the moment we're about 700 miles southwest of Perth. That makes us about halfway to the search area. We're doing about 350 miles per hour at 31,000 feet, and we should be there in the search area in about 2 hours. Okay, the weather we're expecting is about 45 knots of wind at low level, a fair bit of low cloud, and of course quite cool temperatures. Expecting the sea state to be around a 4 or 5, which probably means these guys are going to get bobbed around a fair bit, and that's going to make life pretty hard for them down there. Okay, we've been asked by the Rescue Coordination Centre to search for 2 separate beacons about 15 miles apart. Each beacon's been set off by a different boat. One of them is the Exide Challenger, the other one is the Amnesty International. So we're expecting to go there, search the first area, hopefully locate the survivor, have a look at his condition, and if he's in good condition, we'll then proceed to the next position and look for the survivor of the second vessel. Okay, we'll go there and do the best job we can, of course, and we'll have a talk to you when we get back. Rescue 251 out.
Once the yachtsmen were located, air-sea rescue kits were dropped to them, communication was established, and the GPS fix that was established by the Orions was transmitted to HMAS Adelaide, which in due course arrived to pick them up. Just a final brief piece of audio from Flight Lieutenant Derricks, who had been in radio contact with Dubois.
Okay, he's turning his radio off. Tack. Roger, okay. You on? Yep, just for the crew. He's fine and well. He's a bit cold, but he said he slept last night. He feels quite rested. He's for his family. He just wants to let everyone know that he's okay, and he's sorry that he's causing so many people a heartache.
Now, I am very grateful to have been given this footage by 2 former Defence Media NCOs, then Flight Sergeant RAAF Trevor Grant, who shot the footage on board A9-760, and then leading seaman Royal Australian Navy Brad Cohn, who was gathering footage on board HMAS Adelaide. A9-760 is, of course, as I've said, now proudly on display at the QAM Caloundra, and this is the second of 3 episodes that we are devoting to the RAAF Orions and to our Orion in particular. Last week I spoke with QAM volunteer guide Maurice Ritchie, who piloted Orions and before them Neptunes for the RAAF. Next week you'll hear my conversation with QAM volunteer Ted Gray, who kept a detailed photographic and diary record of the huge undertaking that saw QAM volunteers dismantle A9-760 from where it had landed after its final flight in 2018 at the Sunshine Coast Aerodrome at Maroochydore, then trucked it to QAM and then painstakingly reassembled it. But today you're going to hear from 2 QAM restoration volunteers, a former Air Force aircraft technician, Chris Buley, and a flight engineer, Peter Scovell, both of whom worked on Australia's Orions. These 2 gentlemen, wearing their high-vis, can often be seen around the place on a Tuesday or Wednesday, doing their bit, making their contribution to keep our Orion in good condition so that you can come as a member of the public and stand in awe beneath this massive aircraft and hear something of its history. Before we get to Chris and Pete, don't forget that you can read the provenance of A9760 on the Queensland Air Museum website. Click on Collections and look for the Lockheed Orion, and you'll see photographs and details of its service life meticulously researched by QAM historian Ron Cuskelly. Ron's history includes a detailed record of the January 1997 search and rescue operations. But in order to hear from the people who served in and flew in and worked on these aircraft, it's always a great joy to meet up with the people who are now retired, certainly, but who can look back on many years of service and who are involved on a regular basis maintaining the display. So firstly, we'll hear from Chris Buley, an aircraft technician, lovely guy, and then from another charming gentleman whose uniform, by the way, whose flight suit is on display also. If you get the chance to be guided into the interior of the Orion, greeting you almost immediately is Peter Scovell's flight suit, just to give you an idea of what that looked like. He likes to make the comment that he was a little thinner in those days. Peter, you're looking marvellous today, mate, I can say. So firstly, this was my brief conversation, just a few minutes, with Chris Buley. G'day, Chris.
Yeah, how you going, Gary?
Yeah, good to meet you. First of all, why don't you tell us where you're from and what is your background in aviation?
I was born in the UK, but came here when I was 17 and joined the Air Force in 72. And went through right through to the year 2000, so 28 and a half years I did.
And what were you doing in the RAAF?
I was a aircraft technician on aircraft engines and airframes, things like that.
All right, so what kinds of work would you be doing on airframes and engines?
Mainly on the engines, you'd be doing weekly checks, yearly checks, monthly checks, before flight checks, after flight, in between flight, refueling, oiling, and just generally checking that they're okay and safe to fly.
And you mentioned airframe as well?
Airframes, you'd have a look at any of the structure, make sure there's no damage from bird strikes or people running into them with bikes and things like that. But yeah, no, it's pretty easy really, just looking after the airframes themselves. A visual check usually could tell a lot of stories about whether it was in good nick or not, so yeah.
There must have been times when you needed to pull things apart, but you could generally get a sense by a visual check.
Yep. Things sort of stood out, you soon notice something. If it looks odd, it must be odd, so something's wrong, something's happened.
And which aircraft did you work on?
I started on the DC-3 over in Perth, and the Mackie Jet trainer. I did quite a few years there. Then I came back to Sydney, working on the C-130s and the B-707, Boeing 707s. Then from there back to Perth again for a few years, same aircraft, DC-3 Caribou now, and the Mackie. And from there down to Melbourne to a desk job for 3 years, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I didn't enjoy Melbourne, but that's another story. And then across to Adelaide on the Orion. On the Orion, I did 7.5 years. Thoroughly enjoyed it, probably the best time of my 28 years. And then my last posting was to Amberley at the Ipswich, and I was the engine fleet manager for a couple of years. And then I took a redundancy package and got out.
Okay, now that's fascinating. There's a lot there we could unpack, but let's talk about Orions, because that's what we're doing today.
Yep.
You say it was the best time in your career. Was that because of the aircraft, or what was the reason why it was the best time?
There's probably not only the aircraft, but also the camaraderie with the people you work with, the places you went to, and going on some of the operations of the aircraft all over the world. So it was good.
So tell us about a couple of those. What operations? Where did you go?
I went to Malaysia. Butterworth was the airbase twice for 3-week deployments, and that was good. One flight I went out to, one of the trips out to the east towards Vietnam, and had a look at the ships out there and what they do out there. And then in August 93 I was in the Fincastle 93, which is a submarine hunting competition between the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the English and ourselves, and we won both the trophies that time, so it was good. Very good.
So was it customary for an aircraft technician to travel on these missions?
It would depend where you were going, and unfortunately the costs involved, the monetary costs. Where did you need accommodation and food and things like that? So unfortunately the money did come into it a few times, but most times you could get away with it and go over with them.
Now, let's think about Orions for a second. I mean, we're standing in one right now. It's a magnificent, display that we have here, 760. What are your particular memories of this aircraft to work on?
Probably, as I say, the job satisfaction that I got for the 7.5 years, right from when I first started there to when I left, I didn't want to leave, but had to go. Just mostly job satisfaction and the camaraderie with the guys. I'm still in contact with most of the guys 20 odd years later on Facebook, things like that. So yeah.
And an easy aircraft to work on, difficult? How would you describe it in layman's terms compared to the other aircraft you worked on?
It was perhaps a little bit taxing on the brain a few times. You really had to think about what you were going to do, check the publications, things like that, and just through there. Some of the early airplanes like the Mackie and the Dakota, pretty easy to work on, pretty forgiving airplanes, both of them. So but this one, you really had to think about what you were going to do and organise it from there.
I guess that comes with a more complex and advanced aircraft, doesn't it, with many systems, and therefore it's a bit more complicated.
It is, although it was probably designed back in the late 60s with the Lockheed Electra. It did get updated with a few things, mostly not the engines or airframes, mostly the electronics inside. But some of the things in the engines were slightly better off than they initially were, mostly electronic-wise. So it was a bit of a nightmare sometimes, but we got there.
Now, these Allison turboprops, they delivered how much power?
Each one's about 4,600 horsepower, so it's quite a lot, each one.
Hence, you were able to shut down one or sometimes two and be on loiter speed on a mission.
Yep.
For a civilian to walk in here, it seems extremely luxurious. There's plenty of room. You had air conditioning. You had the galley facilities down the back and rest facilities and so on. Crew of up to 12, 14? Yep,
12, 14 was normal. If you're on a search and rescue mission, you could put up to 20 on board. Those extra guys would be looking at the reserve spots here, looking for fishermen, sailors, things like that out in the water.
Did you participate in any SAR?
No, I didn't. I came close, but no, I didn't. Okay. Not generally, no. Although we looking at ships and things like that up off Butterworth, but there's no missing people.
And what's the future for this particular aircraft? Now that it's here, it's been reassembled, it's...
The things we need to do is just regular maintenance, keeping it clean, tidy. A few little rust spots which are starting to come out now, we're painting those. And just general tidiness of the airplane and keeping it open for the public.
which of course is why it's here. I've heard rumours about air conditioning and powering the internals, is that right?
That's correct, yeah. Hopefully we'll get the air conditioning in soon because it gets pretty hot in here. You can spend about 5 minutes on a hot day and it's just too hot. You have to get out.
That's a pressurised hull in the sun, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is, unfortunately.
Now, you're also a volunteer at the Queensland Air Museum. What do you do here?
Well, as I said, just cleaning up the airplane after visits and maintenance on the aircraft. Not only this aircraft, anything else that needs to be done around the museum. We do sort of stick our heads in every now and then and give them a hand where needed, but mostly we sit on the Orion and just keep it, because it's a big job to look after. It's the biggest airplane here, so it needs a lot of work, a lot of tender loving care.
And would you recommend volunteering here? Has it been a good experience for you?
Oh, definitely. No matter what people do, you know, we've got people here who are gardeners, things like that. So yeah, come on down and join us.
That word camaraderie springs to my mind as a volunteer. I think there's a great experience of that. Well, look, thank you very much, Chris. It's been good talking to you, and all the best with your volunteering work here, and we look forward to seeing the ongoing maintenance and improvements of the Lockheed Orion display. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks very much.
So that was Chris. Next I sat down with Peter Scovell in the galley of the Orion. Way down the rear of the aircraft there is this very well appointed galley with a table and a bench seat for eating, very comfortable, and some bunks that are available for crew rotations, crews getting a rest on one of their very long flights. And, of course, don't forget that this was initially designed by Lockheed as a commercial airliner, the Electra. And so there is plenty of room, and it is well appointed. And I'm sure that aircrew and everybody flying in the Orions appreciated the fact on these very long sorties that they could get a meal, they could sit down, and indeed, as they rotated through their rosters, to get a rest as well and have a lie down. So this is me talking to Peter Scovell.
Yeah, g'day mate. I was born in Sydney and raised, and I was manual labourer. And then my brother came up to me and said, "Pete, you're becoming a bum, why don't you join the Air Force?" And I said, "No, I'll have to get a haircut." And he thought that was hilarious, but he was in the Navy, so it became a bit of a challenge. So I applied and the buggers took me, and I was sort of hoping they'd knock me back. But in the end, I was really happy. It was the best decision I've ever made in my life. And I started off and did rookies at Edinburgh. That's your basic training. And then went to Wagga for my trade training on the engines in general. And then as a posting, I requested Edinburgh, where these Orions were based. That was 76. And so I got posted to these, and so I was quite happy about that because I knew they went around the world, so I got to travel for free. And so I was an engine fitter on the props, much the same as Chris, props and engines. And I did cross-training on airframes, and then with a view to becoming a flight engineer. And after about 5 years, I applied for a flight engineer. I knew they were short. So they accepted me, and I did all the training, and that was really hard. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Yep. Yeah, because you had to know everything, cross the T's, dot the I's.
Well, tell us, what sort of things did you have to know? What does a flight engineer need to know?
Well, basically you are the aircraft systems expert. So anything that goes wrong, you have enough background knowledge to fix it. If it's a part on the engine that's failed, we had a bit of a head start, so we could go out and do a change on a starter motor or a start control valve or whatever. Those are sort of the mechanical things we used to do. The theory things, we had to know the electrics in the aeroplane, and had to know that so well that you were able to draw the AC and DC distribution program, the schematic. You had to be able to draw it to answer the questions in the exams. Okay. that was hard. And a good example of that is if you have a number 2 or 3 generator failure, number 4 is always there in standby to take over that electrical load. And then you had to explain and draw how it happened through the transfer relays and whatnot, so it wasn't easy. But general duties on the aircraft were that we basically did everything up the front end except fly. Part of the pre-takeoff duties were weight and balance, so we had to weigh everything that came on the aeroplane and then figure out where it was going to get stored or where it was normally stored, and then we'd had a slide rule on a sheet of paper, and we worked out the actual centre of gravity and the final all-up weight. Because the centre of gravity had to fall between 16 and 32% of the Mach, the mean aerodynamic chord. Otherwise the aeroplane... So we worked all that out, and then the pilots set their trim accordingly for takeoff, and we did the takeoff data calculations. Like, it's not just write down horsepower, it's what's temperature, what's the QNH, and what sort of horsepower. QNH, pressure altitude. Barometric pressure, when they say 1013, We had to take into account all of these things to calculate the takeoff data. Anyway, then we would start the engines under the pilot's command, and then taxi, and then take off. We'd set the takeoff thrust, and then the climb thrust, and then cruise. And then in between all that, we'd handle any emergencies or any malfunctions that happened. We'd usually get the co-pilot to give us a hand reading our checklist, and we'd sort the problems out.
And you were very hands-on when it came to shutting down an engine in flight and balancing thrust and so on. Was that your role as well?
Yeah, we as normal procedure was to shut down number one engine on the left wing for loiter, and that would save us fuel. And the captain would say, "Pete, shut down number one now." Okay, so let's just reach up and push the feather button.
Now, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but did the captain have anything to do while you were on board? It sounds like you were doing everything.
No, he flew it.
Okay, so he did do something.
Oh yeah, him and the co-pilot. That's what they did. If they touched any of my switches, I'd smack them on the wrist.
It's just such a rare sight these days. Well, it doesn't happen anymore, does it? And certainly passengers flying in commercial aircraft never see a flight engineer because they don't exist anymore.
That's right, they don't know what they're missing.
So having a third person up there essentially sharing the control of the aircraft is a thing of the past, really, isn't it? Are there flight engineers being used anywhere these days?
Only on old airplanes that are being operated. There's no new built airplanes that use flight engineers, and so we're dinosaurs.
And that goes back to the days, does it not, where aircraft became sufficiently complicated and heavy and large for two operators not to be able to keep up with everything, four engines and all of that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's correct. On this particular aircraft, having the third man in the cockpit was very, very essential. It was good because third pair of eyes, and you're operating sometimes down as low as 50 feet off the water. So, and you got this guy flying the airplane, this guy is a safety pilot, and I monitored everything else as well as our safety.
And inside and out, I imagine, because if somebody comes into the Orion and they're guided through, they'll see that third seat. They'll see they're all forward-facing seats in the flight deck, and the centre one is higher. It's raised higher than the others. Looks a bit like a throne.
It is. Well, it's elite.
It's elite, yes. The important presence is there. And so your role is, I imagine that gives you great visibility as well from that location.
Yeah, well, you didn't always sit that high. You could lower the seat down. But it was the best seat in the house. Yeah. And quite often, as the airplane was purpose-built for anti-submarine warfare, quite often we had a visual on a submarine that was snorkeling, had his radar up, and didn't realise we were there. Most of the time, submarines didn't know we were there. And so the flight engineer would get a visual, and then we could put a tax in on that. So, yeah.
So what are your personal memories? You talked about travelling around the world. Now, this is a beautiful airframe to be inside. Just sitting here now with you, these comfortable seats, there's plenty of room, you've got a galley, you've got the air conditioning and so on. So I guess in that sense there's a certain level of creature comfort. But you were up in the air for a long time, weren't you, on some of these operations? What was it like to operate in them?
Fantastic. I mean, it's just like, because we've got this wonderful galley that we can have really good meals prepared. But in general, it was a lot less fatiguing, because if you're in a noisy, horrible, smelly old airframe, it's fatiguing. It makes it worse. But these were great, and you arrived ready to race to the bar.
And how many hours did you have in the air with Orions?
I had 3,500 flight engineer hours and another 500 or so as a groundie, because going away on trips with the aircraft. Yeah.
Any incidents that were a bit of a worry at the time?
Well, we were heavily involved with the Cold War, and not many people in Australia knew that. And we had a few encounters with Soviet ships that I wouldn't like to repeat. A little bit scary.
And you were tracking, logging, surveilling, is that right?
Yeah, we're gathering intel, and it's just the way we went about it sometimes. It was a bit worrying. Can't tell you much about that, but
you'd have to kill me. Okay. Now, obviously the Air Force was called upon from time to time to do search and rescue with these aircraft, because they are so well equipped to find things at sea. I believe your son also has a connection with the Orions.
Yeah, he was posted to Orions after his pilot's course, and then poor bugger, because he had to put up with my shadow. Even though I haven't been there for a long time, there's always is your father? Yeah, he copped that a fair bit, but he did really well for himself, and he ended up as a QFI on the Orion, which is the qualified flying instructor, which is the squadron check pilot, basically. And he did several trips to the Middle East, and was also involved with the MH370 search in WA in this airplane, this very aircraft. And even the one in the Middle East he flew was this airplane. And he was asked to go to America, to VP-30 in Florida, and do a conversion onto the new aircraft, the P-8 Poseidon. And so he did that, and then he was seconded. The US Navy must have liked him, because they asked him to be an instructor at VP-30. He was there for a couple of years. So he was converting people onto the new P-8 as well. So that's a really good posting.
Proud dad much?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He's done really well.
So, look, thank you, Peter. It's great to talk to you. You're a volunteer at the Queensland Air Museum also. You're in here most Tuesdays and Wednesdays in the high vis with all the other guys from the workshop. What are your roles here? What do you do normally?
Well, because I was crew on the on this aircraft, I get called upon a lot to give some tours. But then generally we're just doing maintenance, general maintenance. Last week I touched up all, I don't know if you noticed, I touched up all the propellers with black. Nobody knows until I tell them.
I'll go and have a look on the way out. I'm sure they look great. What are the plans for the future? Like, it's on display here. It's open when there's a guide. What are you planning to do to improve the display in the future?
Well, this aircraft has the potential to be the best display anywhere in the world of an Orion, especially when we get ground power on and the air conditioning. No other Orions are open like this one, and even in America, the ones they have in museums aren't displayed like this. People just can't go in the cockpit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we look forward to the day when we can have air conditioning in here and some lighting, and it becomes a little more climate controlled, because obviously a pressurised hull isn't much fun under the sun, is it, when it's closed up all the time? No. We look forward to that. We'll keep our listeners apprised of that, and I think we'll make a big deal about it as soon as we can unveil that. But Peter, thank you very much, mate. It's great to talk to you, and I know that you guys are doing a fantastic job here. The story of how this aircraft operated in the Air Force, but how this particular airframe got here to Caloundra is quite a story. And we've told many of our visitors that 760 was the aircraft that located Tony Bullimore in 1997, the overturned Rotherwell Yachtsman. So it has a great history, as do you, my friend. And it's great talking to you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it, mate.
So that's our episode today. Thanks for listening. Next week you're going to hear from QAM volunteer Ted Gray. Ted kept a very detailed photographic and written diary and record of the process by which A9-760, having flown its final flight from Edinburgh, South Australia, to Sunshine Coast Airport at Maroochydore, was parked over on the grass, out of the way, and because it had to be, it was there for quite a long time while it was being dismantled, and then each part was trucked across to Caloundra, some 37 kilometres away, and then the volunteers who had dismantled it had the onerous task of reassembling this massive aircraft. That's a great story. Very interesting to hear about how they went through that and succeeded in bringing that aircraft into the condition that it is today so that you can enjoy it when you come and visit, which, please do, open every day from 10 a.m. till 4 p.m, every day except Christmas Day and Good Friday, and we would love to see you. Tell us you've been listening to the podcast. Let us know that you are one of our growing band of loyal podcast listeners, and if you have any suggestions or questions about future episodes that we might be able to tackle, we'd love to hear from you. So that's our episode. Thank you for listening. Come in and see us soon. Bye for now.